The autumn wind carried the scent of burning cedar across the Mohawk Valley as Rebecca Whitmore pressed her face against the rough bark of an ancient oak. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps as she listened to the war cries echoing through the forest behind her. 3 days had passed since the raid on her family's settlement. 3 days since she had watched her younger sister Sarah disappear into the wilderness, bound and thrown over the shoulder of a towering Iroquois warrior named Thunderwolf. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Rebecca didn't know was that her desperate pursuit would lead her into a world where courage meant more than bloodline, where a single act of defiance would reshape the destiny of 2 nations, and where the very warrior who had taken everything from her would become the key to saving what mattered most. The settlement of Mill Creek had stood for barely 5 years when the war party struck. Nestled in a valley where the Susquehanna River bent like a horseshoe, it housed 43 families who had carved their existence from the Pennsylvania wilderness with nothing but determination and steel. Rebecca Whitmore had arrived there with her parents and younger sister when she was 16, old enough to understand the dangers but young enough to believe their small community was somehow protected by providence and distance. From the conflicts that raged between the colonial settlements and the 6 Nations. She was wrong. The attack came at dawn on October 15, 1758, when most of the men were 3 miles downstream checking their fish traps. Rebecca had been in the root cellar beneath their cabin, counting the winter stores of turnips and preserved venison, when the first war cry split the morning air. The sound froze her blood a high, ululating call that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by another, then another, until the valley filled with voices that spoke of death and taking. Above her, she heard her mother Martha scream her name, then Sarah's. Rebecca grabbed the musket her father had taught her to load and climbed the ladder with trembling hands. Through the gap in the cellar door, she saw them 12 warriors painted for war, moving through the settlement like shadows given flesh. Their bodies were decorated with vermilion and charcoal in patterns that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of burning cabins. Some carried tomahawks that gleamed like silver teeth. Others held muskets taken from previous raids. The warrior who took Sarah was impossible to miss. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his chest bare except for a necklace of bare claws that caught the morning light. 3 eagle feathers hung from his scalp lock, and his face was painted with red and black stripes that made his dark eyes look like coal burning in snow. When he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known fear. The other warriors seemed to orbit around him, taking direction from subtle gestures of his massive hands. Rebecca watched through the crack as this giant strode directly to their cabin, as if he knew exactly where to find what he sought. Her mother stood in the doorway, clutching Sarah behind her skirts, and Rebecca could see Martha's lips moving in what must have been prayer or plea. The warrior spoke to her mother in accented English, his voice deep as winter thunder. "You have daughters," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Martha pulled Sarah closer. "Please, she's only 14. Take me instead." The warrior studied both females for a long moment, his head tilted slightly like a wolf deciding which prey offered the best hunt. Then his eyes fixed on Sarah, blonde where Rebecca was dark, delicate where Rebecca was strong, beautiful in the way that made men forget their own names. Sarah had always been the treasure of Mill Creek, the girl that visiting Traeger's sons would ride 50 miles just to glimpse at Sunday services. "This one," Thunderwolf said, pointing at Sarah with a finger decorated with copper rings. "She will bring a good price in Montreal. Or perhaps—" He paused, and something shifted in his expression that made Rebecca's skin crawl. "Perhaps she will make a worthy wife for a war chief." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had heard the stories, whispered around winter fires, of white women taken by war parties. Some were ransomed back to their families. Others disappeared forever into the vast wilderness beyond the frontier, becoming ghosts in their relatives' memories. But a few were adopted into tribes, married to warriors, and became something between prisoner and family member, existing in a liminal space that civilized society couldn't comprehend. Thunderwolf reached for Sarah, and Martha threw herself between them. The warrior barely glanced at her as he swept her aside with one arm, sending her crashing into the cabin wall. Sarah screamed a sound that would haunt Rebecca's dreams for years to come, as those massive hands lifted her as easily as a child might lift a doll. Rebecca burst from the cellar, musket raised, but two other warriors were already moving toward her. She got one shot off. It went wide, splintering bark from a pine tree, before a tomahawk handle cracked against her skull and sent her sprawling. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Thunderwolf's voice again. "Leave that one. She has warrior's blood. If she lives, she may be worth something later." The last thing Rebecca saw before darkness claimed her was Sarah's terrified face looking back over Thunderwolf's shoulder as he carried her toward the tree line. Her sister's lips formed a single word that Rebecca read rather than heard: "Help." When Rebecca regained consciousness, Mill Creek was a graveyard. Smoke rose from 7 burning cabins, including her own. Bodies lay scattered throughout the settlement, some scalped, others merely killed quickly as an afterthought. Her mother was alive but barely conscious, blood seeping from a head wound that would leave her partially blind for the rest of her days. Of the 43 families that had called Mill Creek home, 12 were completely wiped out. 21 had members killed or taken. Only 10 families remained wholly intact, and they were already loading wagons to flee deeper into Pennsylvania. Surviving men had returned to find their world destroyed. Rebecca's father, Thomas Whitmore, knelt beside his wife and remaining daughter with tears streaming down his weathered face. He was a good man, patient, hard-working, devout, but not a warrior. When Rebecca told him what had happened to Sarah, what Thunderwolf had said about making her his wife, Thomas aged 10 years and 10 seconds. "We'll contact the colonial authorities," he said, his voice hollow as wind through a dead tree. "They'll negotiate a ransom. They have to." But Rebecca knew better. She had seen the way Thunderwolf looked at Sarah, the calculating hunger in his eyes. This wasn't about ransom money or political leverage. This was about possession, about a powerful man taking what he wanted because he could. And in the vast wilderness beyond the frontier, there was no colonial authority strong enough to challenge a war chief of the 6 nations. That night, as her parents tended their wounds and the surviving families prepared to abandon Mill Creek forever, Rebecca made a decision that would have been called madness if she had shared it with anyone. She was going after Sarah herself. She knew the odds. She was 18 years old, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with no wilderness experience. Beyond hunting rabbits near the settlement, she had never been more than 10 miles from Mill Creek in any direction. She didn't speak a word of any Iroquois language, had no knowledge of their customs or territories, and possessed no skills that would help her survive in the forest, much less infiltrate a war party and rescue a captive. But she also knew something that the men planning their ineffective rescue attempts did not. Sarah wasn't just her sister, she was her responsibility. Rebecca was the older daughter, the one who was supposed to protect the younger. She had failed once, hiding in the cellar while Sarah was taken. She would not fail again. 3 hours before dawn, while her parents slept the exhausted sleep of grief, Rebecca gathered her supplies. She took her father's best musket, 2 powder horns, a bag of shot, a knife, a hatchet, a blanket, and what food she could carry without depleting their already meager stores. She left a note explaining her decision, knowing that by the time her parents found it, she would be too far into the wilderness for them to stop her. The trail left by Thunderwolf's war party was easy to follow at first. 12 men and a captive. Moving quickly through forests they knew well still left signs that even Rebecca could read: broken branches, disturbed leaves, footprints in soft earth near streams. The warriors had made no effort to hide their passage, confident that no pursuit would come from the destroyed settlement. For the first day, Rebecca followed their trail northwest, deeper into territory that no white woman had ever seen. The forest here was different from the woods around Mill Creek. Older, darker, with trees so massive that 3 men holding hands couldn't circle their trunks. The undergrowth was thick enough that she often had to hack her way through with the hatchet, making noise that would have alerted any listening ears for miles around. By the second day, the trail became harder to follow. The war party had reached the Allegheny River and followed it north for several miles before crossing at a shallow ford. Rebecca lost half a day searching for the place where they had emerged on the western bank, and when she finally found it, the signs were much fainter. The warriors were now moving through their own territory, taking paths they had used since childhood, leaving traces that only another Iroquois could interpret. It was on the third day that Rebecca realized she was being followed. She first noticed it as a feeling, the peculiar sensation of eyes watching from the shadows. Every time she stopped to rest or drink from a stream, the forest around her seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Twice she heard branches snap in the distance, always just far enough away that she couldn't locate the source. Once she glimpsed what might have been a human figure moving between the trees 100 yards to her left, but when she looked again, there was nothing. On the fourth day, her follower revealed himself. Rebecca was kneeling beside a creek, refilling her water skin, when a voice spoke from directly behind her. "White woman travels far from her burning village." She spun around, musket in hand, to find herself facing an Iroquois warrior unlike any she had seen before. He was older than Thunder Wolf, perhaps 50 years, with gray streaking his black hair and deep lines carved around his eyes. His face was painted with white and blue symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the dappled forest light. He carried no visible weapons, but something in his posture suggested he needed none. "You follow Thunder Wolf," the warrior continued in careful English. "You seek the yellow-haired girl he took." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca kept the musket trained on his chest, though she suspected it would do her little good if he decided to attack. "Who are you?" "I am called Gray Fox. I am ... How do you say?" "Uncle to Thunder Wolf. I watch him, make sure he does not bring trouble to our people with his taking of white women." "Then you can help me get her back." Gray Fox's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. "You think to trade? You have nothing Thunder Wolf wants. You think to fight? You would be dead before your musket speaks. You think to steal her away? His village has 50 warriors and twice that many women who would sing songs of your scalping." Rebecca lowered the musket slightly, but kept her finger near the trigger. "Then why are you here?" "Because Thunder Wolf is young and thinks with his pride, not his wisdom. Taking a yellow-haired girl will bring soldiers to our lands, will bring war parties seeking revenge, will bring trouble that my people do not need." Gray Fox stepped closer, and Rebecca could see the intricate beadwork on his leather shirt, patterns that told stories she couldn't read. But perhaps, if someone were to challenge Thunder Wolf in the old way, to prove their worth through courage, rather than strength, perhaps the girl could have won without bloodshed. "What old way?" Gray Fox smiled, and Rebecca saw that several of his teeth were inlaid with silver. "There are laws older than the white man's treaties, older than the Long House itself. Laws about honor and courage and the taking of captives. Thunder Wolf is proud, but he is also bound by these laws. If someone were to prove their worth, if they were to show courage that even a war chief must respect." "You're talking about a trial," Rebecca said, pieces falling into place. Some kind of test. The test of the long path, Gray Fox confirmed. It has not been called for many winters, but the old laws still bind us. If a captive's family member can reach our village on foot, alone, and prove their courage before the council, then the captive's fate must be decided by combat or contest, not by the will of their taker. Rebecca felt her heart racing. And if I fail this test? Then you join your sister as a captive. Or perhaps Thunderwolf simply kills you for the amusement of watching you die. He is not known for his mercy toward those who challenge him. The choice was no choice at all. Sarah was somewhere ahead, probably already suffering in ways Rebecca didn't want to imagine. Every hour that passed took her sister further from any hope of rescue by conventional means. This test, whatever it involved, was the only chance either of them had. How far is your village? For Thunderwolf's war party, moving fast 3 days for white woman who does not know the forest paths. Perhaps 7 days, if she does not die first. Rebecca shouldered her pack and checked her musket. Then I'd better start walking. Gray Fox nodded slowly, something like approval flickering in his dark eyes. The path is marked by stones painted with red earth. Follow them north and west, across 2 rivers and through the Pass of the Crying Winds. Do not leave the path, no matter what you see or hear. Do not hunt, for the forest here feeds only those it chooses. Do not make fire after dark, for light draws things that hunt white flesh. And when I reach your village, ask for the test of the long path. Speak to no one else. Touch nothing that is not offered. And remember that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the mastery of fear. Gray Fox turned to leave, then paused. Your sister is brave. She has not wept, has not begged. Thunderwolf is ... Intrigued by this, it may keep her safe longer than tears would have. Then he melted back into the forest as silently as he had appeared, leaving Rebecca alone with a choice that would determine whether she lived to see another sunset, and whether Sarah would ever again see the world beyond Iroquois territory. Rebecca picked up her pack, checked the priming on her musket, and began walking north toward whatever waited for her in the heart of the 6 Nations. Hunting grounds. The red-painted stones appeared exactly as Gray Fox had described, smooth river rocks, marked with ochre that seemed to glow like drops of blood against the forest floor. Rebecca found the first one within an hour of leaving the creek, positioned beside a massive fallen oak that created a natural bridge across a ravine. The stone was warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight, though the canopy above blocked most of the afternoon sun. She had expected the path to be difficult. What she hadn't anticipated was how the forest itself seemed to respond to her presence, as if the very trees were aware that an outsider walked among them. Branches creaked without wind. Shadows moved independently of their sources. More than once, she caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, quick flashes that vanished the moment she turned her head. The first river crossing came at sunset. The water ran deep and fast, colored dark as coffee by tannins from upstream. Swamps. Rebecca could see the painted stone marking her path on the far bank, but the current was strong enough to sweep away a grown man, let alone a woman carrying a full pack and musket. She spent 20 minutes walking upstream and down, searching for a ford or fallen log, before she noticed the rope had hung from a pine tree on her side of the river, stretching across the water to another pine on the opposite bank. The rope was made from twisted sinew and plant fibers, old but still strong, positioned just high enough above the water that someone could cross hand over hand without getting completely soaked. Rebecca tested it with her weight, then wrapped her pack and musket in her blanket to keep the powder dry. The crossing took 10 terrifying minutes. Halfway across, her arms began to shake from exhaustion, and the rope sagged low enough that her feet dragged in the icy water. Fish scattered beneath her massive trout that looked like living shadows in the dark current. When she finally hauled herself onto the far bank, her hands were raw and bleeding. and her entire body trembled from cold and adrenaline. The painted stone waited for her beside a cedar tree whose bark had been stripped in a spiral pattern. Carved into the trunk above the stone were symbols that looked like a combination of animal tracks and geometric shapes. Rebecca couldn't read them, but something about their arrangement suggested they were meant as a warning. The second day brought different challenges. The path led through a swamp where the painted stones were positioned on small islands of solid ground, connected by logs so slippery with moss that each step required careful balance. The air here was thick with mosquitoes and flies that seemed to find every exposed inch of skin. Worse were the sounds: distant splashing that could have been large fish or something else entirely, and a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Rebecca was picking her way across one of the moss-covered logs when she saw her first clear sign that she wasn't alone in the swamp. On a muddy bank 30 yards to her left, a line of footprints led from the water to a thicket of cattails. The prints were human, but wrong, somehow too wide, with toes that spread further than any foot should spread. Whatever had made them was walking upright, but wasn't quite human. She quickened her pace, forcing herself not to look back even when the humming sound grew louder behind her. The painted stone that marked her exit from the swamp sat atop a small hill covered in white birch trees. When she reached it, Rebecca allowed herself one glance back at the wetland she had just crossed. Something large moved beneath the dark water where she had been walking minutes before, creating ripples that spread in perfect circles across the still surface. The third day brought her to the Pass of the Crying Winds, and she understood immediately how it had earned its name. The path wound between two massive stone cliffs that rose like cathedral walls on either side, creating a natural corridor where the wind was channeled and amplified until it produced sounds that were almost human. Sometimes the wind sounded like children singing. Other times it moaned like women in mourning. Once, for a terrifying moment, it perfectly mimicked Sarah's voice calling Rebecca's name. The painted stones here were different, larger, with symbols carved directly into the rock faces of the cliffs. Some of the carvings were clearly ancient, worn smooth by centuries of weather. Others looked recent, the stones still sharp-edged where metal tools had bitten into the rock. Rebecca paused to study one that showed a figure that might have been human, surrounded by what looked like a pack of wolves or dogs. Below it, in fresher carving, someone had added symbols that formed a pattern like a map dot. She was still studying the carving when the first Wolf appeared. It materialized from behind a boulder as if it had been carved from the same gray stone, padding silently across the narrow path to position itself between Rebecca and the exit from the pass. The animal was larger than any wolf she had ever heard described, easily the size of a small horse, with yellow eyes that held an intelligence that made her skin crawl. Its coat was silver gray with black markings that seemed to shift and flow like smoke. Rebecca slowly unslung her musket, but before she could bring it to bear, two more wolves appeared on the cliffs above her, moving along ledges that looked too narrow for anything larger than a squirrel. Their eyes reflected the afternoon sunlight like mirrors, and when one of them opened its mouth, she could see teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. The pack leader, the gray giant, blocking her path, sat down on its haunches and studied her with the patience of a predator that had never known hunger. Its ears were forward, alert but not aggressive. After several long minutes, it let out a single, low howl that echoed between the cliff walls like the voice of the mountain itself. The howl was answered from ahead, then from behind, then from points all around the pass. Rebecca realized she was surrounded by a pack of at least a dozen wolves, each one larger and more intelligent-looking than any natural animal should be. They weren't attacking, but they weren't letting her pass either. They were waiting for something. That something became clear when Gray Fox emerged from behind the same boulder where the pack leader had first appeared. He moved among the giant wolves like a man walking through a field of loyal dogs, scratching ears and receiving gentle nudges in return. When he reached the pack leader, the massive wolf stood and pressed its head against the old warrior's chest in a gesture that was almost human in its affection. "The forest spirits test all who walk the long path," Gray Fox said, his voice carrying easily in the acoustics of the pass. "They do not speak your language, but they understand courage. They have watched you cross the river and the swamp. They have seen that you do not turn back when afraid. Do not fire your weapon at shadows. Do not abandon your purpose when the way becomes hard." Rebecca kept her musket ready, but didn't point it at any of the wolves. And their verdict? Gray Fox spoke to the pack leader in a language that consisted entirely of growls, whines, and subtle body movements. The conversation lasted several minutes, with other pack members occasionally adding their own vocalizations. Finally, the old warrior turned back to Rebecca. "They say you carry the scent of one who walks between worlds, not fully white, not fully red, but something that could become either. They will let you pass, but they give warning. The tests ahead are not of the forest. They are of the people. And people are often more dangerous than wolves." The pack melted away as suddenly as it had appeared, vanishing among the rocks and shadows of the pass. Only the leader remained, watching Rebecca with those unsettling yellow eyes until she shouldered her pack and continued walking. Even then, she could feel its gaze on her back until the pass curved and she lost sight of the entrance. The fourth day brought her out of the mountains and into rolling hills covered with oak and maple trees that were beginning to turn brilliant colors. The painted stones led her along ridge lines that offered stunning views of the territory. Ahead, an endless expanse of forest broken by silver, ribbons of rivers, and the occasional clearing where smoke rose from hidden villages. It was here that Rebecca first began to encounter signs of human habitation. Not the crude blazes and stumps that marked white settlements, but subtle modifications that worked with the natural landscape instead of against it. Trees had been pruned to grow in specific shapes that provided both camouflage and communication. Clearings had been created in patterns that looked random, but served to funnel game along predictable routes. Even the streams had been modified with carefully placed stones that controlled flow and created fishing pools. She was studying one such fishing pool, marveling at the engineering skill required to create something so effective while making it look completely natural. When she heard voices speaking in the Mohawk language, Rebecca froze, crouching behind a fallen log, while 3 Iroquois women came into view on the far side of the stream. They were dressed in beautiful clothing, soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork and dyed porcupine quills. 2 of them appeared to be middle-aged, probably mothers or aunts in the village hierarchy. The third was younger, perhaps Rebecca's own age, with long black hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the sunlight like stars. The women were gathering plants, roots and berries that Rebecca didn't recognize but that they clearly knew were valuable. They worked efficiently, talking quietly among themselves as they filled large baskets with their harvest. Their conversation was punctuated by occasional laughter, the kind of easy companionship that spoke of lifelong friendship. Rebecca found herself studying their faces, trying to reconcile these normal, pleasant women with the terrifying warriors who had destroyed Mill Creek. These were the same people, the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of the men who had killed her neighbors and taken her sister. Yet they seemed so human, so much like the women of any community, anywhere, working together to provide for their families. The realization was disturbing in ways she hadn't expected. It was easier to think of the Iroquois as monsters, inhuman savages who could be fought without moral complexity. But these women reminded her that the people she was walking toward had their own lives, their own families, their own reasons for the things they did. The war party that had attacked Mill Creek hadn't emerged from some hellish void. They had come from a place like this, where women gathered berries and laughed with their friends. The women finished their gathering and disappeared back into the forest, but their voices lingered in Rebecca's mind as she continued following the painted stones. She was entering a world where she would be the outsider, the savage, the one whose customs and beliefs seemed strange and threatening. The thought was sobering that the fifth day brought rain, not the gentle drizzle that was common in Pennsylvania, but a cold, driving storm that turned the forest floor into a maze of slippery mud and hidden obstacles. The painted stones became harder to spot through the curtain of water, and more than once Rebecca had to backtrack when she realized she had wandered off the path. The storm also brought wildlife seeking shelter. Rebecca found herself sharing a large hollow log with a family of raccoons who chattered at her in what sounded like indignant conversation. Later, she took refuge beneath a rock overhang that was already occupied by a black bear and her two cubs. The mother bear looked at Rebecca with mild interest but no hostility, as if humans sheltering from storms was a common occurrence in this part of the forest. It was during this storm that Rebecca had her first clear view of Thunderwolf's village. She was cresting a hill when the rain momentarily lightened, providing a window of visibility across the valley below. The village sprawled along both sides of a river that was probably a tributary of the Allegheny, with perhaps 60 longhouses arranged in patterns that seemed to follow the natural contours of the land. Smoke rose from dozens of cooking fires, and she could see people moving about their daily business despite the rain. The largest longhouse sat on a small rise at the center of the village, its roof decorated with carved posts that rose like the spines of some great beast. Even from a distance, Rebecca could see that this building was different from the others, larger, more elaborate, clearly the home of someone important. Someone like a war chief. Somewhere down there, Sarah was probably sitting in darkness, wondering if anyone was coming for her, wondering if she would ever see home again. The thought filled Rebecca with a mixture of determination and terror that made her hands shake as she gripped her musket. The sixth day brought her to the edge of the village territory. The painted stones now appeared every few hundred yards, and the forest showed clear signs of regular human use. Paths branched off in multiple directions, leading to hunting camps, fishing spots, and sacred places marked by carved poles. Rebecca passed several burial platforms built in the branches of ancient oaks, where the dead were laid to rest closer to the sky. She also began to encounter sentries. The first one was a young warrior, who couldn't have been more than 16. Painted for hunting rather than war, armed with a bow and a quiver of arrows fletched with turkey feathers. He watched her from behind a maple tree for nearly a mile before revealing himself by stepping directly into her path. "White women follow the long path," he said in heavily accented English. "Village knows you come. Elders wait to hear your words." Rebecca nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat was dry with fear and anticipation. The young warrior gestured for her to follow him, then led her along a path that was clearly the main route to the village. Other sentries appeared as they walked, older warriors who studied Rebecca with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility. None of them spoke, but she could feel their eyes cataloging every detail of her appearance, her weapons, her manner of walking. As they approached the village proper, Rebecca began to hear the sounds of daily life: children playing, women calling to each other, dogs barking, the rhythmic thudding of corn being ground in wooden mortar. Normal sounds that reminded her, again, that this was a real community full of real people, not some mythical place from frontier legends. The young warrior led her to the edge of the central clearing, then stopped and pointed toward the large longhouse she had seen from the hilltop. "Thunder. Wolf waits," he said simply. "Your sister waits. Elders wait. You go now to speak your purpose, or you die before sunset. Choose." Rebecca checked her musket one final time, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward whatever waited for her in the longhouse of the war chief who had taken everything that mattered to her in the world. The interior of Thunder Wolf's longhouse was nothing like Rebecca had imagined. Instead of the crude shelter she expected, She found herself in a space that rivaled the finest buildings in Philadelphia for both size and craftsmanship. The structure stretched nearly 200 feet in length, with a vaulted ceiling supported by massive timber beams, carved with intricate designs that seemed to tell stories in wood. Smoke from multiple fire pits drifted upward through carefully engineered openings that drew the air without creating drafts. But it was the people gathered inside that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. Nearly 50 Iroquois sat in a perfect circle around the central fire pit, arranged by what was clearly a complex hierarchy she didn't understand. Warriors painted for the ceremony sat beside women whose clothing was so elaborate it must have taken months to create. Elders with faces like weathered stone occupied positions of obvious honor, while younger members of the community filled the spaces between. All of them watched Rebecca with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely contained hostility. And there, in the place of highest honor directly across the fire from the entrance, sat Thunderwolf. The war chief looked even more imposing in the flickering firelight than he had during the raid on Mill Creek. His massive frame was draped in a cloak made from the pelts of wolves, and his chest bore fresh paint in patterns that seemed to move and shift in the dancing shadows. The 3 eagle feathers in his hair had been joined by others, creating a fan-like display that marked him as a leader of considerable standing. His dark eyes fixed on Rebecca the moment she entered, and she felt the weight of his attention, like a physical force, but it was the figure seated to Thunder Wolf's right that made Rebecca's heart raced with a mixture of relief and terror. Sarah sat on a platform covered with soft furs, dressed in Iroquois clothing that had clearly been made specifically for her. Her blonde hair had been braided with silver ornaments and feathers, and her skin bore the kind of healthy glow that came from good food and careful treatment. She was alive, unharmed, and apparently well cared for. But when her eyes met Rebecca's across the fire, the expression in them was complex relief mixed with warning, hope tempered by fear. An elderly woman rose from her position near Thunder Wolf and stepped forward. She was small and bent with age, but something in her manner commanded absolute attention from everyone in the longhouse. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had never been questioned. "I am Bright Moon, keeper of the old laws, grandmother to Thunder Wolf, speaker for the clan mothers." Her English was perfect, with only the slightest accent. "You come to our village following the long path. You claim the right of the ancient trial. Speak now, white woman, and tell us why we should not simply add your scalp to Thunder Wolf's lodgepole." Rebecca forced herself to stand straight, despite the exhaustion that made her legs tremble. Every eye in the longhouse was fixed on her, and she could feel the weight of judgment in their collective gaze. The wrong word here would mean death for both her and Sarah. "I am Rebecca Whitmore, sister to the woman your war chief has taken. I come not as an enemy seeking war, but as family seeking family. I invoke the test of the long path as is my right under the old laws." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, some approving, others clearly hostile to the idea of a white woman claiming ancient rights. Bright Moon raised her hand for silence, and the longhouse became so quiet that the crackling of the fire sounded like thunder. "The test of the long path has not been called for 7 winters," the old woman said. "It is a right that belongs to the people of the longhouse, not to the whites who steal our land and kill our children." "Then let me earn that right," Rebecca replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I have walked 6 days through your forest, faced your trials, followed your painted stones without deviation. I have shown respect for your laws and your land. If I am not worthy to claim this right, then prove it. But if I have earned consideration through my courage, then honor the old ways as you claim to honor them." Thunder Wolf spoke for the first time, his deep voice filling the longhouse like distant thunder. "The white woman has spirit. She followed my trail for many days, crossed the river of the sacred fish, passed through the swamp where the ancient ones sleep, walked the pass of the crying winds without turning back. The forest spirit spoke to Gray Fox of her courage. Gray Fox himself emerged from the shadows at the far end of the longhouse, moving silently despite his age. The wolves accepted her presence. The bear mother shared shelter with her during the storm. The spirits of the path did not turn her away. By the old laws, she has earned the right to speak. Bright Moon studied Rebecca for a long moment, then looked to the other elders. A silent communication passed between them, subtle nods, meaningful glances, the kind of wordless conversation that spoke of decades of shared decision-making. Finally, the old woman turned back to Rebecca. Very well. You may claim the test of the long path, but understand, young woman, that this test is not merely about your sister. You challenge the right of a war chief to keep what he has taken in honorable combat. You question his judgment, his authority, his very worthiness to lead. If you fail this test, both you and your sister will pay the price for your presumption. And if I succeed, then your sister's fate will be decided by combat or contest, as the old laws require. But know this: Thunder Wolf has never been defeated in any challenge. He has counted coup on 17 enemies, taken 34 scalps, and led 7 successful raids against our enemies. He is not a man who loses. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to nod. I understand the stakes. What must I do to prove my worth? Bright Moon gestured to a young warrior standing near the wall. Bring the bundle of testing. The warrior disappeared into the shadows and returned carrying an object wrapped in what looked like white doeskin decorated with elaborate beadwork. He placed it reverently beside the fire pit, then retreated to his position. Bright Moon knelt beside the bundle and began to unwrap it with ceremonial care. Inside were objects that clearly held deep spiritual significance: carved stones, bundles of herbs, what looked like the preserved claws of various animals, and several items that Rebecca couldn't identify, but that radiated an aura of ancient power. The old woman selected 3 objects and placed them on the ground before Rebecca. The test of the long path has 3 parts, Bright Moon explained. First, the test of truth. You must speak truly of your heart, holding nothing back, hiding no feelings or intentions. The spirits will know if you lie, and they will judge you accordingly. She gestured to the first object, a smooth stone that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Second, the test of wisdom. You must prove that you understand the consequences of what you ask, that you comprehend the world you seek to enter. Ignorance is not an excuse when lives hang in the balance. The second object was a carved wooden mask with features that shifted and flowed in the firelight. Third, the test of courage. You must face what you fear most. Confront the darkness in your own heart and emerge unchanged by the experience. Many who attempt this test are broken by what they discover about themselves. The final object was a small clay bowl filled with a liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. These tests are not games, white woman. They have broken the minds of warriors and driven wise men to madness. They reveal truths that cannot be unseen, force choices that cannot be unmade. Are you certain you wish to proceed? Rebecca looked across the fire at Sarah, saw the fear and hope warring in her sister's eyes, and made her choice. I am ready. Bright Moon nodded and picked up the glowing stone. Then let us begin with the truth. Place your hands upon the stone of clear seeing and speak from your heart. Why do you truly seek your sister's return? What drives you through dangers that would turn back seasoned warriors? Rebecca took the stone in both hands and immediately felt a strange warmth spread through her palms. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced, as if the stone was somehow connected to her thoughts, her emotions, her very soul. When she spoke, the words seemed to come from someplace deeper than conscious thought. I seek my sister because I failed her when she needed me most. I hid in the cellar while she was taken, saved my own life while hers was stolen away. I cannot live with that cowardice, cannot face my parents or myself if I do not try to make it right. But more than guilt drives me. Sarah is the best of us, kind where I am harsh, gentle where I am hard, beautiful where I am plain. She deserves a life of her own choosing, not to be a prize in some warrior's lodge. And ... Rebecca paused, surprised by the intensity of the emotions the stone was drawing from her. And I am tired of being powerless, tired of hiding while others make the choices that shape our lives. If I die in this attempt, at least I will die trying to control my own fate instead of cowering in a root cellar. The stone grew warmer in her hands, and she felt a strange sense of lightness, as if some burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had suddenly been lifted. Bright Moon nodded approvingly and gestured for her to set the stone aside. Truth recognized. You speak from genuine feeling, not from pride or hatred. This is good. The spirits respond better to authentic emotion than to false righteousness. The old woman picked up the wooden mask. Now for wisdom. What do you understand about what you ask? If your sister is returned to you, what then? Do you imagine you will simply walk back to your white world and resume your former lives? Rebecca took the mask and immediately felt its weight, not physical weight, but the psychic burden of all the questions she had been avoiding. When she looked through the eye holes, the world around her seemed to shift and change, showing possibilities and consequences she hadn't considered. If Sarah returns with me, she will never be fully accepted by our people again. They will whisper that she was defiled, that she chose to stay with savages, that she cannot be trusted. If she remains here and adapts to your ways, I may never see her again, and our parents will mourn her as dead. There is no choice that does not bring pain, no outcome that leaves everyone whole. The mask showed her more visions of possible futures stretching out like branches on a tree. Sarah married a colonial farmer who could never quite trust her past. Sarah raised half Iroquois children who belonged fully to neither world. Sarah grew old in an Iroquois village, surrounded by people who respected her, but would never consider her fully one of them. But wisdom, Rebecca continued, is not about finding perfect solutions. It is about making the best choice available, even when all choices carry pain. Sarah should have the right to choose her own path, to decide whether she wants to return to our world or build a new life here. That choice belongs to her, not to Thunderwolf, not to me, not to anyone else. The mask grew lighter in her hands, and the visions faded. Bright Moon nodded again, but her expression was more serious now. Wisdom accepted. You understand that there are no easy answers, no solutions that please everyone. This understanding will serve you well in what comes next. She picked up the clay bowl filled with the light-absorbing liquid. Now comes the most dangerous test. The test of courage requires you to drink from the bowl of deep seeing and face what the spirits show you. Some see their own death. Others see the destruction of everything they love. A few see truth so terrible that they never speak again. Are you prepared for this? Rebecca looked at the bowl and felt something like ice forming in her stomach. But across the fire, Sarah was watching with desperate hope in her eyes, and that was enough. I am prepared. She took the bowl and drank the liquid in one swallow. It tasted like nothing she had ever experienced, not bitter or sweet, but somehow like the essence of darkness itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded into visions that crashed over her like ocean waves. She saw Mill Creek burning again, but this time she was standing in the flames, watching herself cower in the cellar while her sister screamed for help. She saw Thunderwolf claiming Sarah not as a captive, but as a willing bride. Saw her sister accept in Iroquois ways, and turning her back on the white world forever. She saw herself dying alone in the forest, her quest a failure, her bones picked clean by carrion birds, but worse visions followed. She saw Sarah returning to Pennsylvania only to be rejected by their own people, branded as soiled goods, forced to live as an outcast. She saw their father broken by the loss of both daughters, their mother dying of grief. She saw the two worlds, white and red, locked in endless cycles of violence, with every act of revenge spawning new atrocities on both sides. And finally, she saw herself as Thunderwolf must see her, not a heroic rescuer, but a naive girl whose interference would only bring more suffering to everyone involved. She saw her own pride, her own need to prove herself, her own selfish desire to be the hero of her sister's story. The visions reached a crescendo of horror that made her want to scream, to flee, to beg for mercy. But at the center of all the darkness, she found something unexpected, a core of determination that could not be broken by fear or doubt or the weight of terrible knowledge. She understood now that courage was not the absence of fear, but action taken despite fear. It was not ignorance of consequences, but commitment despite full knowledge of the price. And most importantly, it was not about being heroic or noble or worthy of songs, but simply about refusing to let fear make her choices for her. The visions faded, and Rebecca found herself back in the longhouse, still holding the empty bowl. Every person around the fire was watching her with new respect, not because she had passed the tests, but because she had emerged from them still herself, still committed to her purpose despite everything the spirits had shown her. Bright Moon took the bowl from her trembling hands and set it aside with the other objects. Courage proven. You have seen the worst possibilities and chosen to continue anyway. You have faced your own darkness and emerged with your purpose intact. By the old laws, you have earned the right to challenge your sister's fate. Thunderwolf rose from his seat, his massive frame casting an enormous shadow in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice filled the longhouse with quiet authority. The white woman has proven her worth. She may choose the manner of contest single combat, test of skill, or trial by ordeal. But know this, brave sister, I have never lost such a challenge. Your courage honors you, but it may also doom you. Rebecca stood to face him, her legs still shaking from the visions, but her voice steady. I choose trial by ordeal. Not because I think I can defeat you in combat or match your skills, but because the spirits should decide my sister's fate, not mortal strength or cleverness. A gasp ran through the gathered crowd. Even Bright Moon looked surprised by her choice. Trial by ordeal has not been called for 20 winters, the old woman said. It is the most dangerous of the 3 options, for it places your fate entirely in the hands of powers greater than ourselves. Are you certain this is your choice? Rebecca looked once more at Sarah, saw her sister's lips move in what might have been a prayer or a plea. Then she turned back to Thunderwolf and the assembled council. It is my choice. Let the spirits decide what justice looks like. The sacred grove where trials by ordeal were conducted lay a half-mile from the village. Hidden in a natural amphitheater carved by centuries of wind and water into the limestone bedrock. Ancient oaks formed a perfect circle around the central space, their trunks so massive that 10 men holding hands could not encircle them. Between their roots, stones carved with symbols older than memory marked the boundaries where the physical world gave way to the realm of spirits. Rebecca had been given an hour to prepare herself while the village made ready for the ceremony. Thunderwolf's sister, a stern woman named Winterhawk, had provided her with ritual clothing, a simple deerskin dress painted with protective symbols in white and blue. The paint was still wet against her skin as the procession made its way through the forest, led by Bright Moon, carrying a staff crowned with raven feathers. The entire village followed. Men, women, children, and elders moved in respectful silence through the trees, their faces painted for ceremony, their finest clothing decorated with quillwork and beadwork that caught the fading afternoon light. Even the dogs seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion, padding quietly at their owner's heels without their usual playful energy. Thunderwolf walked beside Rebecca, no longer the terrifying war chief who had destroyed her world, but something approaching an equal participant in an ancient ritual. He had changed from his ceremonial clothing into the simple breechcloth and leggings of a warrior prepared for spiritual combat. His massive frame was painted with symbols that spiraled across his chest and arms protective magic that had been passed down through generations of his family. "You understand," he said quietly as they approached the grove, "that trial by ordeal is not combat between us. We are both subject to the judgment of the spirits. They may choose to test us separately or together, or in ways that mortal minds cannot predict. I have participated in such trials 3 times, each nearly killed." Rebecca glanced at him, surprised by what sounded almost like concern in his voice. "Why did you take her? Sarah, I mean. Of all the people in our settlement, why her?" Thunderwolf was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, just as they reached the edge of the sacred grove, he spoke. "Because she reminded me of my first wife. White Dove was taken by smallpox 5 winters ago, along with our 2 sons. When I saw your sister's courage during the raid, she did not weep or beg, did not grovel for mercy. I saw in her the strength that White Dove possessed. I thought ... Perhaps the spirits had sent me a second chance at happiness." The honesty in his admission caught Rebecca off guard. She had expected him to speak of conquest or revenge or the right of the victor to claim spoils. Instead, she heard the voice of a man who had lost everything and was trying to fill an emptiness that could never truly be filled. "Sarah isn't White Dove," she said softly. "She's her own person, with her own dreams and fears and desires. You can't replace what you've lost by taking someone else." "No," Thunderwolf agreed, his dark eyes fixed on the sacred grove ahead. "I have learned this in the days since bringing her to my village. Your sister is brave, but her bravery is different from White Dove's. Her spirit calls to different places for different purposes. Perhaps the spirits brought you here not to take her from me, but to show me that some things cannot be claimed, only freely given." They entered the grove as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and scarlet. The assembled villagers arranged themselves in a large circle around the perimeter, their faces solemn with the weight of witnessing something that connected them to powers beyond the everyday world. Children clung to their mothers' hands, sensing the charged atmosphere, even if they didn't understand its source. In the center of the grove stood a structure that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. It was a lodge built entirely from the bones of massive animals, what looked like the ribs and skulls of creatures far larger than any that walked the modern world. The bone lodge glowed with an inner phosphorescence that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with barely visible energy. Bright Moon positioned herself at the entrance to the bone lodge and raised her raven-feathered staff. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly to every person in the grove, though she didn't seem to be shouting. "We gather in the sight of the ancestors, in the presence of the Great Spirit, to witness trial by ordeal. 2 souls seek judgment. Thunderwolf, war chief of the Wolf clan, who claims the right to keep what he has taken in honorable combat, and Rebecca Whitmore, sister seeker, who challenges that claim in the name of blood and family. Let the spirits decide which cause is just." She gestured toward the bone lodge. "Thunderwolf, enter the lodge of testing and await the spirit's judgment." The war chief walked toward the structure without hesitation, his massive frame moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator. As he approached the entrance, the phosphorescent glow intensified, and Rebecca could swear she heard something like distant thunder rolling across the sky. Though no clouds marred the clear evening air, Thunderwolf disappeared into the lodge, and the glow immediately dimmed to a barely perceptible shimmer. For several minutes, nothing happened. The assembled villagers waited in perfect silence, their eyes fixed on the bone structure, as if they expected it to suddenly explode or vanish. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. No bird calls, no rustle of leaves, no distant animal sounds, Then the screaming began. It came from inside the lodge, not Thunder Wolf's voice, but something else, something that sounded like the cries of 100 different creatures, all expressing agony at once. The bone structure began to shake, its ancient joints creaking and grinding as whatever was happening inside threatened to tear it apart. The phosphorescent glow flared and dimmed in rhythm with the screams, like a gigantic heartbeat made of light. Rebecca found herself gripping her hands together so tightly that her nails drew blood. Beside her, several of the villagers had begun to chant in low voices, their words in the old language that predated even the formation of the 6 nations. The chanting seemed to have a stabilizing effect on the lodge, reducing the violence of its shaking but not stopping the terrible sounds emanating from within. The ordeal lasted nearly an hour. When it finally ended, the sudden silence was almost more disturbing than the screaming had been. The lodge went completely dark, its glow extinguished as if someone had snuffed out a candle. For several terrifying minutes, Rebecca wondered if Thunderwolf had been killed by whatever forces had been testing him. Then the war chief emerged from the entrance, and Rebecca barely recognized him. Thunderwolf looked like he had aged 20 years in the space of an hour. His powerful frame was bent with exhaustion, his skin pale beneath the ceremonial paint. But most shocking were his eyes. They held a depth of knowledge and pain that hadn't been there before, as if he had seen things that no mortal was meant to witness. When he walked, it was with the careful steps of someone whose legs might betray him at any moment. Bright Moon stepped forward and examined him closely, her experienced eyes noting details that Rebecca couldn't interpret. After a long moment, the old woman nodded. "The spirits have tested Thunderwolf and found him ... changed. What did you see in the lodge of testing, War Chief?" Thunderwolf's voice, when he spoke, was hoarse as if he had been screaming for hours. "I saw White Dove as she was when the sickness took her, not peaceful in death, but angry at being torn from life before her time. I saw my sons as they would have grown to be, warriors, fathers, leaders of our people. I saw the life I could have had if I had not been so consumed with war and taking that I forgot to cherish what I already possessed." He looked directly at Rebecca, and she saw something like recognition in his haunted expression. "And I saw your sister, not as a replacement for what I lost, but as herself, a woman with her own path to walk, her own choices to make. The spirits showed me that holding her against her will dishonors both her memory of White Dove and Sarah's own spirit." Bright Moon nodded slowly. "The spirits have spoken their judgment concerning Thunderwolf. Now it is the Sister Seeker's turn to face their testing." Rebecca felt her mouth go dry as the old woman gestured toward the bone lodge. The structure had begun to glow again, but the light was different now, colder, more blue than white, with undertones that reminded her unpleasantly of the color of corpses. "Rebecca Whitmore, enter the lodge of testing and discover what the spirits would show you of your own heart." Rebecca forced her legs to carry her toward the entrance. As she approached, she could feel the energy radiating from the bone structure, like heat from a forge, though the sensation was more spiritual than physical. The closer she got, the more her skin seemed to crawl with electricity, and she could taste something like copper on her tongue. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at the assembled villagers. Sarah was standing near the front of the crowd, her face pale but determined. Their eyes met across the distance, and Sarah mouthed a single word: "Courage." Rebecca nodded and stepped into the lodge. The interior was nothing like what she had expected. Instead of a cramped space formed by animal bones, she found herself in what appeared to be a vast cavern that stretched beyond the reach of the phosphorescent light. The walls were covered with paintings that seemed to move in her peripheral vision, images of hunts, battles, ceremonies, and events she couldn't identify, but that filled her with a deep sense of unease. As her eyes adjusted to the strange light, she began to notice that she wasn't alone. Figures moved in the shadows at the edge of her vision, not quite human, not quite animal, but something that existed in the spaces between classification. When she tried to look directly at them, they seemed to dissolve, only to reappear in different locations as soon as she turned away. A voice spoke from the darkness, though she couldn't locate its source. It sounded like her own voice, but older, wearier, touched with a sadness that went bone deep. Why do you seek to interfere with what has been chosen by fate? Because my sister deserves better than to be some man's possession, Rebecca replied, surprised that her voice came out steady, despite the fear that was making her hands shake. And what makes you think she considers herself his possession? Have you asked her what she wants, or have you simply assumed that your desires and hers are the same? The question hit Rebecca like a physical blow. In all her desperate planning and dangerous journey, she had never actually considered the possibility that Sarah might not want to be rescued. She had assumed that her sister was suffering, that she was being held against her will, that she would naturally want to return to their family and their former life. "She's 14 years old," Rebecca said, but even as the words left her mouth, she realized how weak they sounded. "You were 14 when your family came to the frontier. Old enough to help clear land, build cabins, defend against raids. Old enough to take a husband if the right man had asked. Why is your sister too young to make choices about her own life?" Images began to appear in the phosphorescent, light-knot paintings on the walls, but three-dimensional scenes that played out before her like memories made visible. She saw Sarah during her first days in Thunder Wolf's village, terrified and defiant. But then the scenes shifted, showing her sister gradually adapting to Iroquois ways, learning their language, helping with the daily work of the community. In one scene, Sarah was teaching Iroquois children to read English words from a book she had somehow acquired. In another, she was working alongside Thunder Wolf to design a better system for preserving food through the winter. Most shocking of all was a scene where Sarah was laughing, genuinely laughing, at something one of the village women had said. Her face bright with the kind of joy Rebecca hadn't seen since before their father had announced they were leaving civilization for the frontier. "She's adapting," Rebecca whispered, more to herself than to the voice in the darkness. "She's surviving. She's making the best of her situation, as humans do. But that doesn't mean she's choosing it freely, and it doesn't mean she's happy. The question you must answer is this: are you here to save your sister, or are you here to save yourself from the guilt of not trying?" The question cut to the heart of everything Rebecca had been trying not to examine too closely. Yes, she wanted to save Sarah, but she also wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't a coward, that she could be the hero of her own story instead of the girl who hid in cellars while others faced danger. "Both," she said finally, the honesty surprising her. "I want to save her because I love her and because she deserves the chance to choose her own path. But I also want to prove that I'm not the frightened child who let her be taken without even trying to help. And if saving her means accepting that her choice might be to stay, if rescuing her means giving her the freedom to reject rescue." The possibility had never occurred to Rebecca, and it filled her with a terror that was deeper than any physical danger she had faced. What if she had risked everything, walked through 6 days of hell, faced down war chiefs and ancient spirits, only to discover that Sarah wanted to build a new life among the Iroquois? "Then I accept her choice," Rebecca said, and meant it. "But I need to know that it is truly her choice, made freely, without coercion or fear. If she chooses to stay, I'll find a way to live with that. But she has to know that she has options, that her family hasn't forgotten her, that there's still a place for her in the world she came from." The phosphorescent light flared brighter, and Rebecca felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the lodge's energy. The shadowy figures at the edge of her vision solidified into recognizable forms: ancestors, spirits, the accumulated wisdom of generations stretching back to the beginning of time. One figure stepped forward, and Rebecca recognized her grandmother. Dead these past 10 years, but appearing exactly as she had in life. Martha Whitmore had been a woman of uncompromising principles and fierce love for her family, the kind of person who could face down wolves or hostile warriors with equal determination. "You've learned the hardest lesson," her grandmother's spirit said with a smile that Rebecca remembered from childhood. "True love means wanting what's best for someone else, even when it's not what you want for yourself. Your sister is lucky to have you as her champion, not because you'll drag her away from danger, but because you'll make sure she has the power to choose her own fate." The vision faded, and Rebecca found herself back in the bone lodge, which had returned to its normal size and proportions. The testing was over, and she had survived it with her purpose clarified rather than broken. She stepped out of the lodge to find the entire village waiting in respectful silence. Thunder Wolf stood near Bright Moon, his expression unreadable in the gathering twilight. But it was Sarah who commanded Rebecca's attention. Her sister was standing apart from the crowd, her face a mixture of hope, fear, and something that might have been relief. Bright Moon raised her staff once more. "The spirits have tested both souls and found them worthy of their purposes. Thunder Wolf has learned that true strength lies in letting go, not in holding on. Rebecca Whitmore has learned that true love means accepting whatever choice brings happiness to the beloved, even if that choice brings pain to the lover." The old woman turned to address the entire assembly. "By the ancient laws, the trial by ordeal is complete. The spirits have rendered their judgment. Sarah Whitmore must now choose her own path, to return to the white world with her sister, or to remain among us and build a new life as one of our people. The choice is hers alone, made freely, without coercion from any side." All eyes turned to Sarah as she stepped forward into the center of the grove. In the fading light, with the phosphorescent glow of the bone lodge casting strange shadows across her face, she looked older than her 14 years, not aged by suffering, but matured by experiences that had forced her to grow up quickly. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly to every person in the grove. "I need time to decide." The 3 days that followed Sarah's request for time to decide stretched like years for everyone involved. The village had granted her the traditional period of contemplation, 3 sunrises and 3 sunsets to consider a choice that would shape the rest of her life. During this time, she was housed in Bright Moon's own lodge, cared for by the clan mothers, but isolated from outside influence. Neither Rebecca nor Thunder Wolf was permitted to speak with her, though both found reasons to pass near the old woman's dwelling multiple times each day. Rebecca had been given quarters in the lodge of Winterhawk, Thunder Wolf's sister, who proved to be a woman of surprising depth and complexity. Unlike her massive brother, Winterhawk was small and quick, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. She spoke excellent English, having learned it from captured traders over the years, and she used this skill to help Rebecca understand the intricacies of Iroquois society. "Your sister has changed since coming here," Winterhawk said on the second morning as they prepared corn cakes over the cooking fire. "At first, she wept every night and refused to eat." Thunder Wolf was not that frustrated. He had expected her to be grateful for being chosen by a war chief, to see the honor in her situation. Rebecca carefully turned a corn cake to prevent it from burning, using the mundane task to mask her emotional turmoil. But she adapted. She did more than adapt. She began to ask questions about our customs, our beliefs, our way of organizing society. She was particularly interested in the role of women in our councils, the way mothers choose chiefs, the power of the clan mothers to remove leaders who fail their people. Winterhawk smiled slightly. "I think she was surprised to discover that women here have more political power than in your white settlements." The observation stung because it was true. In Pennsylvania, women were expected to submit to their fathers, then their husbands, with little say in matters beyond household management. The idea that Sarah might find more freedom among the Iroquois than she would in colonial society was deeply unsettling. Is that why she's considering staying political freedom? Winter Hawk considered the question while adding maple syrup to her corn cake. Partly, but I think the real reason is more complex. Your sister has discovered that she enjoys being seen as herself, not as someone's daughter or potential wife. Here, her opinions matter. Her ideas about improving food storage and teaching children have been adopted by the village council. She has found purpose beyond just surviving. Rebecca felt a knot forming in her stomach. And Thunder Wolf, what does he want now? My brother is changing. The trial by ordeal showed him things about himself that he didn't want to see. He realizes now that taking a wife by force, even if she eventually accepts her situation, builds a marriage on fear rather than affection. He has told the council that he will accept whatever choice your sister makes, even if it means losing her forever. The third day brought unexpected visitors to the village. A delegation of colonial officials arrived under a flag of truce, led by Captain Jonathan Hartwell of the Pennsylvania militia. Rebecca recognized him. Immediately, he was the same officer who had dismissed her father's pleas for help in rescuing Sarah, claiming that the colonial government couldn't risk war with the Six Nations over one captured girl. Captain Hartwell was a tall, severe man with graying hair and the kind of military bearing that suggested he had seen considerable combat. He rode into the village with 20 armed men, their uniforms bright against the autumn forest, their muskets held ready despite the peace banner they carried. Thunderwolf met them at the village edge, flanked by 50 warriors whose relaxed posture couldn't quite hide their readiness for violence. The war chief had painted himself for diplomacy rather than war, but his massive frame and the tomahawk at his belt sent a clear message about what would happen if the negotiations went poorly. I am Captain Hartwell, representing the colonial government of Pennsylvania, the officer announced in a voice that carried clearly across the village. I have come to negotiate the return of Sarah Whitmore, unlawfully taken from a peaceful settlement. Thunderwolf's response was equally formal, but delivered in heavily accented English that made each word sound like a small threat. I am Thunder Wolf, war chief of the Wolf clan. The woman you seek is here by right of capture in legitimate warfare. Your people killed our hunters, stole our land, broke treaties made with our grandfathers. We take what is ours by the same right you claim when you burn our villages. Rebecca watched the exchange from Winterhawk's lodge, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and dread. The arrival of colonial forces offered a potential solution to the crisis, but she had learned enough about Iroquois culture to know that any attempt to take Sarah by force would result in a bloodbath that would consume the entire region. Captain Hartwell seemed to understand this as well. Instead of making threats, he gestured to one of his men, who brought forward a wooden chest bound with iron. We offer ransom for the girl's return. Silver, trade goods, weapons, and a formal treaty guaranteeing safe passage for Iroquois hunters through Pennsylvania territory during the winter months. The offer was substantial, more than most families would see in a lifetime. But Thunderwolf barely glanced at the chest before shaking his head. Your silver cannot buy what has already been given freely. The woman you call Sarah Whitmore is under the protection of our laws, subject to our customs, honored as a daughter of our clan. She will choose her own path according to our traditions, not yours. Captain Hartwell's face darkened. You cannot seriously expect us to accept that a 14-year-old girl captured in a raid has any legal standing to choose her captors over her own family. She has passed through the trials of adoption. She has learned our ways, contributed to our community, earned respect among our people. By our laws, she's no longer captive but clan member. Her choice is protected by traditions older than your colonies. The standoff might have escalated into violence if Bright Moon hadn't chosen that moment to emerge from her lodge, leading Sarah into the central clearing. The old woman's timing was clearly deliberate. She had waited until the tensions were highest to introduce the element that would force everyone to confront the reality of the Situation. Sarah looked different than she had 3 days earlier. The uncertainty that had marked her demeanor during the trial by ordeal had been replaced by something approaching confidence. She wore traditional Iroquois clothing, but her bearing was uniquely her own, neither fully white nor fully native, but something new that incorporated elements of both worlds. She walked directly to the center of the space between the two groups, positioning herself so that she could address both the colonial delegation and the village council simultaneously. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had thought carefully about every word. "Captain Hartwell, I know. You've come here believing you're rescuing me from a terrible fate. My sister Rebecca has traveled hundreds of miles and risked her life because she believed the same thing. And 3 months ago, when I was first brought here, you would have been right." Sarah's gaze moved to include Thunderwolf and the assembled warriors. "But I need everyone to understand that I am not the same person who was taken from Mill Creek. I have learned things here that I never could have learned in colonial society. I have been given responsibilities and respect that no 14-year-old girl in Pennsylvania would ever receive. I have discovered capabilities within myself that I didn't know existed." Captain Hartwell stepped forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing alarm. "Miss Whitmore, you cannot seriously be considering remaining with these savages. Think of your family, your future, your duty as a Christian woman." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger that reminded Rebecca powerfully of their grandmother. "Don't call them savages, Captain. These people have shown me more respect for my intelligence and judgment than any white man ever has. They have laws that protect women, customs that value wisdom over brute strength, traditions that recognize that true leadership comes from service to the community, not dominance over it." She turned to face Thunderwolf directly. "But I also cannot forget that I was brought here against my will, that my family has suffered because of my absence, that there are people in Pennsylvania who love me and deserve to know that I'm alive and well." Thunderwolf nodded slowly. "What would you choose, Sarah Whitmore? Your birth family or your adopted clan? The world you knew or the world you have discovered?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from face to face Rebecca, Thunderwolf, Captain Hartwell, Bright Moon, Winter Hawk, and dozens of others who had gathered to witness her decision. When she finally spoke, her words surprised everyone. "I choose both." The statement sent murmurs of confusion through both groups. Captain Hartwell looked bewildered, while several of the Iroquois warriors exchanged glances that suggested they thought she had lost her mind. Sarah raised her hand for silence and continued. "I want to return to Pennsylvania with my sister and Captain Hartwell. I want to see my parents, to let them know that I'm alive and unharmed, to assure them that I was treated with honor during my time here. But I also want to return here for part of each year, to continue learning from the clan mothers, to help bridge the gap between our two peoples." Bright Moon stepped forward, her ancient face thoughtful. "You speak of living in two worlds. This is not impossible, but it is difficult. You would belong fully to neither, always seen as an outsider by some in each community. Then I'll help create a third way," Sarah replied with a determination that made her sound far older than her years. "There are others like me, white captives who have learned to value Iroquois ways, Iroquois people who have lived among whites and understand both cultures. Perhaps it's time for someone to build bridges instead of walls." Thunderwolf looked skeptical. "The colonial government will never agree to such an arrangement. They see us as enemies to be conquered, not neighbors to be understood." Captain Hartwell's expression confirmed this assessment. "Miss Whitmore, I cannot permit you to return to hostile territory. My orders are to secure your release and ensure your safety among civilized people." "Then your orders will have to change," Sarah said firmly. "Because I'm not going anywhere unless I have your guarantee that I'll be free to come back here when I choose to do so." The confrontation that followed was unlike anything Rebecca had ever witnessed. Sarah, 14 years old and barely 5, Feet tall, face down, a captain of colonial militia and a war chief of the Iroquois with equal determination. She refused to be intimidated by threats, wouldn't be swayed by appeals to duty or tradition, and calmly demolished every argument that tried to force her into a choice between two absolute positions. "You want me to pretend that the last 3 months never happened," she told Captain Hartwell. "You want me to go back to Pennsylvania and become the same girl I was before, marry some farmer's son, and spend my life cooking and bearing children without ever using anything I've learned here. That's not rescue, that's another kind of captivity." To Thunderwolf, she was equally direct. "You want me to abandon my birth family completely, to act as if 14 years of my life meant nothing, to become fully Iroquois and never look back. But that would mean betraying the love that brought my sister here to find me, and I won't do that either." The deadlock seemed complete until Winter Hawk stepped forward with a suggestion that changed everything. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "there is precedent for what Sarah proposes. There are traders who live between worlds, missionaries who travel back and forth, diplomats who maintain relationships with both peoples. What if Sarah were recognized as something similar, an official intermediary between Pennsylvania and the 6 nations? Captain Hartwell looked dubious, but Bright Moon nodded thoughtfully. "The idea has merit. We have long needed someone who truly understands both cultures to help prevent the misunderstandings that lead to war. Sarah has proven herself capable of learning our ways while maintaining connection to her birth people. But she's just a girl," Captain Hartwell protested. "She's a woman who has survived capture, adapted to a completely foreign culture, and proven her worth to both communities," Rebecca said, speaking for the first time since the negotiations had begun. "She's earned the right to choose her own path, even if that path is different from what any of us expected." The debate continued for hours, with details argued and re-argued as the sun moved across the sky. But gradually, a framework began to emerge. Sarah would return to Pennsylvania with the colonial delegation, but only after the government formally recognized her status as an unofficial ambassador to the Iroquois. She would spend winters with her birth family and summers with her adopted clan, carrying messages and negotiating minor disputes that might otherwise escalate into violence. Thunderwolf was the last to agree to the arrangement, and his consent came with conditions. If Sarah chooses this path, she must be protected by both peoples. Any harm that comes to her while serving as intermediary will be considered an act of war by the responsible party. And if she ever chooses to abandon this role and live in only one world, that choice must be respected by all. As the agreement took shape, Rebecca felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that Sarah would be coming home, at least partially. Pride at her sister's strength and wisdom in creating a solution that no one else had imagined. But also a kind of grief for the simple rescue she had originally envisioned, where she would save Sarah, and everything would go back to the way it had been before. Sarah seemed to sense her conflicted feelings. As the final details were being negotiated, she approached Rebecca and took her hands. "I know this isn't what you hoped for when you came here," Sarah said quietly. "You wanted to save me from a terrible fate and bring me home unchanged. But the truth is, I didn't want to be saved from this life. I wanted to be given the power to choose whether to keep it or leave it behind." Rebecca squeezed her sister's hands, feeling the calluses that had developed from months of work in the Iroquois village. "Are you happy with your choice?" "I'm terrified by my choice," Sarah admitted with a laugh that sounded more mature than any 14-year-old should. "I'm going to be living between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, probably criticized by both for not being committed enough to their way of life. But I'm also excited by the possibilities. Maybe I can help prevent future raids like the one that brought me here. Maybe I can build something new that honors the best of both cultures." As the sun set on the third day, the village prepared for a farewell ceremony that would mark Sarah's transition from adopted clan member to traveling ambassador. But Rebecca knew that whatever happened next, the girl who returned to Pennsylvania would be fundamentally different from the one who had been taken from Mill Creek. The question that remained was whether the world they were returning to would be ready for someone who refused to accept that the only choices were conquest or surrender, civilization or savagery. US or them. Sarah Whitmore was about to find out whether there was room in colonial society for a woman who insisted on creating her own category. 5 years had passed since Sarah Whitmore first walked back into Pennsylvania society wearing a mixture of colonial dress and Iroquois ornaments, her presence challenging every assumption about what a rescued captive should look like. The arrangement that had seemed so revolutionary in Thunder Wolf's village had proven both more difficult and more successful than anyone had imagined. Rebecca stood at the window of her small cabin near Lancaster, watching her sister approach. Through the autumn morning mist, Sarah was returning from her summer among the Iroquois, as she had every year since the agreement was struck, but this time was different. This time, she carried news that would change everything. At 19, Sarah had grown into a woman who commanded attention in any room she entered. Her bearing combined the confidence of Iroquois leadership training with the determination she had inherited from their grandmother. She spoke 4 native languages fluently, could negotiate trade agreements that satisfied both colonial merchants and tribal councils, and had personally prevented 3 separate conflicts from escalating into open warfare. She was also one of the most controversial figures in Pennsylvania. "Sister," Sarah called as she approached the cabin, her voice carrying the warmth that had sustained Rebecca through 5 years of watching their parents struggle to understand the daughter who had returned to them so changed. "I bring word from the council fires, and it's not news that can wait for a proper homecoming." Rebecca stepped outside, immediately noting the tension in Sarah's posture. Her sister had learned to control her expressions during diplomatic negotiations, but Rebecca could still read the subtle signs of worry in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands moved restlessly to check her possessions. "What's happened?" "War is coming," Sarah said without preamble. "Not the small raids and counter-raids we've been managing to prevent, but real war. The British are planning something massive for next spring, a coordinated assault on all 6 nations' territory simultaneously. They've been secretly building up supplies and recruiting soldiers throughout the colonies." Rebecca felt ice form in her stomach. The fragile peace that Sarah's diplomatic work had maintained was built on the understanding that both sides had too much to lose from open conflict. If the British were planning total war, it meant they had decided that conquest was more valuable than coexistence. "How do you know this?" "Because Thunder Wolf told me." Sarah's expression was grim. His warriors captured a British courier carrying detailed battle plans. "The assault is scheduled for early June, when the spring planting is finished but before the summer hunt begins. They're planning to hit 6 villages simultaneously, destroy the food stores, and force the entire Iroquois population to either surrender or starve." Rebecca sank onto the wooden bench outside their cabin door. "And the council's response?" "They're preparing for war. Every village is calling in their warriors, forming alliances with tribes that have been neutral for decades, reaching out to the French for military support. Bright Moon estimates they can field over 2,000 fighters by spring." The numbers were staggering. A conflict of that scale would consume the entire region, drawing in every settlement from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes. The careful balance of power that had allowed places like Lancaster to prosper would be shattered, replaced by a struggle for survival that could last for decades. "There has to be another way," Rebecca said, though even as she spoke the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. "There might be," Sarah replied, sitting down beside her sister. "But it would require something that's never been attempted before, a formal treaty between equals, not a negotiation between conquerors and conquered. The Iroquois would need guarantees that their territorial rights would be respected permanently, not just until the next land rush. The British would need assurances that trade routes would remain open and that friendly tribes would help defend against French expansion. Rebecca studied her sister's face, recognizing the expression Sarah wore when she was working through the details of a particularly complex diplomatic problem. "You have a plan." "I have the beginning of a plan." But it would require the colonial government to do something they've never done before: treat the Six Nations as a sovereign nation capable of making binding agreements, not as conquered peoples who should be grateful for whatever scraps of territory they're allowed to keep. The implications were enormous. Such a treaty would essentially recognize the Iroquois as equals on the international stage, with rights that couldn't be overridden by colonial expansion or British imperial policy. It would create a permanent Native American state in the heart of North America, with defined borders and guaranteed sovereignty. "The British will never agree to that," Rebecca said. "They might, if the alternative is losing every settlement west of Philadelphia." Sarah pulled a folded document from her traveling pack. "I've been working on this with some of the more progressive colonial administrators. There are people in the government who understand that endless warfare is bad for business, that peaceful trade relationships are more profitable than conquest and occupation." Rebecca unfolded the document and found herself looking at what appeared to be a formal treaty draft, written in both English and what she assumed was one of the Iroquois languages. The terms were unlike anything she had ever seen in colonial negotiations. They granted the Six Nations permanent sovereignty over a clearly defined territory, established formal diplomatic relations between the Iroquois Confederation and the Pakuva British Crown, and created mechanisms for resolving disputes without warfare. "This is revolutionary," Rebecca said, scanning the carefully worded clauses. "If something like this were actually signed, it would change everything," Sarah finished. "Not just for Pennsylvania, but for every colony dealing with native populations. It would establish the precedent that indigenous peoples have rights that must be respected, not privileges that can be revoked when convenient." Rebecca looked up from the document to study her sister's face. "And Thunderwolf? What does he think of your plan?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Thunderwolf has become different over these 5 years. The trial by ordeal changed him in ways that are still becoming apparent. He's less interested in glory through warfare, more focused on securing a future for his people that doesn't depend on constant conflict." There was something in Sarah's tone that made Rebecca pay closer attention. "Sarah, are you and Thunderwolf?" "We've grown close," Sarah admitted, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Not in the way he originally imagined when he took me from Mill Creek, but as equals working toward common goals. He's taught me about Iroquois law and military strategy. I've taught him about colonial politics and trade relationships. We've become partners." Rebecca felt a complex mixture of emotions at this revelation. Part of her was happy that her sister had found someone who respected her intelligence and capabilities. But another part worried about the complications such a relationship would create for Sarah's already complex position between two worlds. "Do you love him?" Sarah considered the question seriously before answering. "I love the man he's become, yes. But I'm also realistic about what that means. A formal marriage between us would satisfy neither of our communities completely. The Iroquois would always see me as somewhat foreign, and colonial society would consider me irredeemably corrupted by savage influence. So what will you do?" "What I've been doing for 5 years, create a third option that no one expected." Sarah's smile held a hint of mischief that reminded Rebecca of their shared childhood. "Thunderwolf and I have decided to formalize our partnership in a way that honors both traditions without being constrained by either. We'll have a ceremony that incorporates elements of both Iroquois and colonial marriage customs, but we'll structure our relationship around our diplomatic work rather than conventional domestic expectations." Rebecca struggled to wrap her mind around what her sister was describing. You're creating your own kind of marriage? We're creating our own kind of everything, Sarah replied. Our own form of partnership, our own style of diplomacy, our own way of living between cultures without betraying either one. It's terrifying and exhilarating and completely unprecedented. Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of hoofbeats announced the arrival of visitors. A small group of riders was approaching the cabin colonial officials by their dress, but traveling without the military escort that usually accompanied government delegations to the frontier. The lead rider was a man Rebecca recognized as William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Northern Colonies. Johnson was one of the few colonial officials who had consistently supported Sarah's diplomatic work, understanding that her unique position made her invaluable for maintaining peace on the frontier. "Miss Whitmore," Johnson called as he dismounted. "I've ridden hard from Albany with news that couldn't wait for official channels. The British government has received word of the planned Iroquois military buildup. They're considering a preemptive strike to prevent any coordinated native resistance." Sarah stood immediately, her diplomatic training taking over. "How much time do we have?" "Perhaps 2 weeks before the orders come down from London. Maybe less if the reports of French involvement are confirmed." Johnson's expression was grim. There are people in government who believe that this is the perfect opportunity to settle the Indian question permanently, to clear the way for unlimited westward expansion. Rebecca felt the weight of crisis settling over them like a physical presence. Everything Sarah had worked for over the past 5 years was about to be destroyed by the very forces she had been trying to overcome. "Then we accelerate the timeline," Sarah said with a determination that reminded Rebecca powerfully of their grandmother facing down wolves. "Mr. Johnson, I need you to arrange a meeting with every moderate voice in colonial government today. If possible, tomorrow at the latest. I need them to understand that they have a choice between permanent peace and permanent war, but they have to make that choice now." Johnson nodded. "And the Iroquois Council?" "I'll handle the council personally. But I need guarantees that any treaty proposal will be taken seriously by London, not dismissed as frontier idealism. Can you provide those guarantees?" "I can provide them," Johnson said after a moment's hesitation. "But only if you can deliver something equally concrete from the Six Nations. London needs to believe that this is a genuine opportunity for peace, not a delaying tactic while the tribes prepare for war." Sarah was already moving toward her horse, her mind clearly racing through the complex logistics of what she was proposing. "Then we do something that's never been done before. We arrange simultaneous negotiations, colonial representatives meeting with Iroquois leaders at a neutral location, with full authority to sign binding agreements on behalf of their respective governments. The logistics alone would be staggering." Johnson protested. "Getting all the necessary people to the same place at the same time, with proper authority to negotiate, ... The alternative is watching this entire region burn," Sarah interrupted. "Mr. Johnson, in 2 weeks there could be 2,000 Iroquois warriors and an equal number of British soldiers preparing to slaughter each other. Every day of delay makes peaceful resolution less likely and total war more inevitable." Rebecca watched her sister transform before her eyes from a young woman, sharing personal news into a diplomatic force capable of reshaping the political landscape of North America. It was both inspiring and terrifying to witness. "What do you need from me?" Rebecca asked. Sarah turned to her with an expression of gratitude mixed with determination. "I need you to go to our parents to help them understand that what I'm about. To attempt might be the last chance to prevent a war that would destroy everything we've all worked to build. And I need you to be prepared for the possibility that I might not be coming back. Sarah, no. If this works, if we actually manage to create a lasting peace between the British and the Six Nations, my role as intermediary will become permanent. I'll spend my life traveling between councils and capitals, negotiating disputes and preventing conflicts. I'll still visit, but Pennsylvania will never again be my primary home." Rebecca felt tears she hadn't expected burning her eyes. "And if it doesn't work? If it doesn't work, then the war will consume everything anyway, and none of our choices will matter." Sarah embraced her sister fiercely. "But it will work. It has to work, because the alternative is unthinkable." As Sarah mounted her horse and prepared to ride toward what might be the most important negotiations in the history of North America, Rebecca realized that her little sister had become something unprecedented, a woman capable of standing between empires and demanding that they choose peace over conquest. The girl who had been taken from Mill Creek as a captive was about to attempt something that kings and generals had failed to achieve: the creation of a lasting peace built on mutual respect rather than domination, whether she succeeded or failed. Sarah Whitmore had already accomplished something remarkable. She had refused to accept that the only options were victory or defeat, civilization or savagery, us or them. Instead, she had created a fourth possibility: the radical idea that different peoples could coexist as equals, each contributing their strengths to a future that honored the best of all their traditions. As Rebecca watched her sister disappear into the morning mist, riding toward a destiny that would reshape the continent, she whispered a prayer to whatever spirits watched over women brave enough to demand that the world change to accommodate their vision of what it could become. Outcome of Sarah's final diplomatic mission would determine whether the next chapter of American history would be written in blood or ink, whether the frontier would be remembered as a place where civilizations clashed, or where they learned to dance together in harmony. Either way, no one would ever again be able to say that such peace was impossible, because Sarah Whitmore had proven that even the most entrenched conflicts could be transformed by someone willing to live between worlds and insist that both had value worth preserving. The Great Council Lodge at the confluence of the Susquehanna and Juniata rivers had never hosted a gathering like this one. Built specifically for the negotiations in just 10 days by crews of both Iroquois and colonial workers, the massive structure combined architectural elements from both cultures: European timber framing supporting traditional longhouse proportions, with ceremonial spaces designed according to ancient Haudenosaunee protocols. Inside, the most powerful figures from two civilizations sat facing each other across a fire that had been lit with flames carried from both Philadelphia and the sacred council fires of Onondaga. The symbolism was deliberate. This was not a meeting between conquerors and conquered, but between equals seeking common ground. Sarah stood at the center of the lodge, no longer the frightened girl who had been taken from Mill Creek or even the confident young woman who had spent 5 years building bridges between worlds. At 19, she had become something entirely new: a diplomatic force, capable of commanding the attention of governors and war chiefs alike. Her clothing reflected this transformation: a formal dress that incorporated colonial styling with Iroquois beadwork, topped by a cloak made from white wolf fur that marked her as a speaker for peace in both traditions. To her left sat the colonial delegation: Governor Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, William Johnson as British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Colonel George Washington representing Virginia's interests, and 3 other colonial officials with authority to negotiate on behalf of the Crown. Each man carried credentials signed by King George himself, granting them unprecedented power to make binding agreements with indigenous nations. To her right sat the Iroquois Council: Bright Moon as keeper of the old laws, Thunder Wolf representing the war chiefs, Red Jacket speaking for the younger generation of leaders, and 4 clan mothers whose combined authority could overrule any decision made by the male chiefs. Behind them sat representatives from allied tribes, Delaware, Shawnee, and even Cherokee leaders who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness what might be the most important negotiations in Native history. The tension in the lodge was so thick, it seemed to have physical weight. Everyone present understood that the next few hours would determine whether the frontier exploded into total war or found a path toward lasting peace. The armies gathering on both sides, British regulars and colonial militia to the east, thousands of native warriors to the west, waited for word from this council to begin either celebration or slaughter. Sarah had spent the previous 3 days in separate meetings with both delegations, ensuring that each side understood not just what the other was offering, but why those offers mattered. The preliminary negotiations had been brutal, with fundamental disagreements about sovereignty, territorial rights, and the nature of political authority itself. "Before we begin the formal negotiations," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the lodge, "I want everyone here to understand what we're really trying to accomplish. This isn't just about preventing a war, though that would be achievement enough. We're attempting to create something that has never existed before, a formal relationship between European and indigenous powers based on mutual respect rather than domination." Governor Morris shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was a practical man who understood that war with the Six Nations would be devastating for Pennsylvania, but he also represented a government that had never treated any native tribe as a true equal. "Miss Whitmore, while we appreciate your unique perspective on these matters, we must be realistic about what's politically possible. The Crown cannot simply ignore its legal claims to territorial sovereignty." Thunderwolf's response was immediate and pointed. "Your Crown's legal claims are based on documents signed by men who had no authority to give away land that belonged to our grandmothers. You claim sovereignty over territory you have never controlled, never defended, never earned by any law our people recognize." "But surely you understand," Colonel Washington interjected, "that European settlement of this continent is inevitable. The question isn't whether it will happen, but whether it happens peacefully or through constant warfare." Red Jacket stood to respond, his young voice carrying an edge that made several colonial officials reach instinctively for their weapons. "Inevitable because you say it is? Because your people breed like rabbits and consume land like locusts? Perhaps what is truly inevitable is that a people who take without giving, who break every agreement they make, will eventually face the consequences of their greed." Sarah raised her hand before the exchange could escalate further. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that has led us to the brink of war. Both sides are operating from assumptions that make peace impossible. The colonials assume their expansion is a natural right. The natives assume that resistance requires total rejection of European presence. We need to find a third path." She gestured to a large map that had been mounted on the lodge wall, not the typical European-style chart that showed only rivers and mountains, but a complex document that incorporated both colonial surveys and native territorial concepts, showing hunting grounds, sacred sites, seasonal migration routes, and traditional boundaries. "The proposal before us creates something new. A confederation of autonomous territories with defined boundaries and guaranteed rights. The Six Nations maintain complete sovereignty over their traditional homelands, while colonial settlements receive formal recognition of their territorial claims within agreed-upon limits." Bright Moon spoke for the first time, her ancient voice demanding immediate attention from everyone present. The young peace speaker shows wisdom, but her words are easier to say than to implement. How do we trust promises from a government that has broken every previous agreement? How do we believe that this treaty will be honored when all others have been discarded when convenient? The question cut to the heart of the deepest obstacle facing the negotiations. The history of European-native relations was littered with broken treaties, violated agreements, and promises that lasted only until the next wave of settlers demanded new concessions. Sarah had anticipated this challenge, and her response revealed the depth of her preparation. Because this treaty includes enforcement mechanisms that have never been tried before. Both sides agree to the establishment of permanent diplomatic missions, Iroquois representatives in Philadelphia and London, colonial representatives at Onondaga, Any disputes are adjudicated by joint councils with equal representation from both governments. She pointed to specific sections of the proposed agreement. More importantly, the treaty includes automatic military assistance clauses. If colonial settlers violate Iroquois territorial rights, the Crown agrees to use British forces to remove them. If neighboring tribes attack colonial settlements, the Six Nations agree to provide military support for defense. Governor Morris looked skeptical. "You're asking us to potentially use British soldiers against our own colonists. That's politically impossible. And you're asking us to potentially fight other native peoples to protect white settlements," Thunderwolf added. "That's equally difficult for our people to accept." "Which is exactly why it might work," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "Neither side can break this agreement without losing the military support they need to survive on the frontier. The mutual defense clauses create a system where both parties have strong incentives to honor their commitments." Colonel Washington leaned forward, studying the map with the eye of a military strategist. "The territorial boundaries you're proposing would essentially create a native state in the heart of North America. That's unprecedented in European colonial policy. It's also the only way to prevent permanent warfare," Sarah responded. "The current system of treating native peoples as subjects to be managed rather than neighbors to be respected guarantees constant conflict. This treaty acknowledges what's already true, that the Six Nations function as a sovereign government with the military power to enforce their will." Red Jacket nodded approvingly. "The peace speaker understands what your colonial officials have refused to see. We are not your subjects, not your wards, not children to be managed by your governments. We are a nation with our own laws, our own territories, our own rights that exist whether you recognize them or not." The negotiations continued for hours, with each clause of the proposed treaty examined, debated, and modified to address concerns from both sides. The trade provisions alone required 3 separate revisions, as both delegations struggled to create commercial relationships that would benefit their peoples without creating new sources of conflict. As the sun reached its zenith, Sarah called for a recess to allow both sides to consult privately about the evolving agreement. But instead of joining either delegation, she stepped outside the lodge to walk along the riverbank, needing a moment to process the magnitude of what was taking shape. Thunderwolf found her there, standing beside the water where the 2 rivers merged into a single stronger current. "You've accomplished something remarkable," he said, joining her at the water's edge. 6 months ago, both sides were preparing for total war. Now they're arguing about the details of trade agreements and diplomatic protocols. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability away from the intense scrutiny of the negotiations. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for someone to walk away from the table, for the whole fragile structure to collapse." "It might still happen," Thunderwolf admitted. "There are people on both sides who would prefer war to the kind of compromise we're discussing. But you've created something that didn't exist before, a framework for peace that addresses the real concerns of both peoples." Sarah looked at the confluence of the 2 rivers, seeing in their merger a metaphor for what she was trying to accomplish. "Do you think it will hold, this agreement we're building?" "I think it has a better chance than anything that's been tried before," Thunderwolf replied. "Because it's based on the recognition that neither side can achieve security through domination. It requires both peoples to give up some of their dreams of total control in exchange for the reality of peaceful coexistence." They were interrupted by the approach of William Johnson, who had emerged from the lodge with an expression of cautious optimism. "Miss Whitmore, the colonial delegation has reached consensus on the major provisions. We're prepared to sign the agreement as currently drafted, subject to ratification by Parliament within 6 months." Sarah felt her heart race with a mixture of excitement and terror. "And the Iroquois Council?" "Bright Moon is consulting with the clan mothers now. They should have a decision within the hour." As they returned to the lodge, Sarah realized that the outcome of 5 years of diplomatic work would be determined in the next few minutes. Everything she had sacrificed, her childhood, her simple life in Pennsylvania, her clear identity as either white or native, had led to this moment, when two civilizations would choose between war and an unprecedented experiment in peaceful coexistence. The council reconvened as the afternoon sun slanted through the lodge's smoke holes, creating columns of golden light that seemed to bless the proceedings. Bright Moon stood slowly, her ancient frame commanding absolute attention from everyone present. "The clan mothers have spoken," she announced in a voice that carried the authority of centuries. "We accept the treaty as negotiated, with one additional provision. Sarah Whitmore, who speaks for peace between our peoples, will serve as the permanent ambassador between our governments, with full diplomatic status in both London and Onondaga." Governor Morris nodded formally. "The colonial delegation accepts this provision and all other terms of the agreement. We are prepared to sign the Treaty of Two Rivers in the name of His Majesty King George II. Thunderwolf stood and walked to the center of the lodge, carrying a tomahawk with a silver blade that had been crafted specifically for this ceremony. With deliberate care, he buried the weapon in a wooden post that had been erected beside the fire. "By this act, the hatchet is buried between our peoples," he declared. "Let no one take it up again while this treaty stands." Governor Morris responded by breaking a sword across his knee and casting the pieces into the fire, where they hissed and sparked as the metal was consumed by flames. As the formal signing began, with representatives from both sides adding their names to copies of the treaty written in English, Mohawk, and Latin, Sarah felt the weight of history settling around her. This document would either mark the beginning of a new era of peace on the North American frontier, or it would be remembered as the last attempt at diplomacy before an inevitable war of extermination. But as she watched the most powerful figures from two civilizations commit their governments to an experiment in peaceful coexistence, Sarah allowed herself to hope that perhaps the world was finally ready for a different kind of relationship between peoples, one based on mutual respect rather than conquest, on negotiation rather than violence, on the radical idea that different cultures could coexist as equals in the same land. The Treaty of Two Rivers would face many challenges in the years to come, and Sarah Whitmore would spend the rest of her life defending and implementing its provisions. But on this day, beside the confluence of two rivers, she had proven that even the most entrenched conflicts could be transformed by someone willing to imagine a different kind of future and work tirelessly to make it real. 20-5 years had passed since the Treaty of Two Rivers was signed, and the world had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Sarah Whitmore Thunderwolf stood on the balcony of her diplomatic residence in Philadelphia, watching ships from across the Atlantic unload cargo that included not just European goods, but textiles woven by Iroquois women, medicines prepared by native healers, and furs traded through the peaceful networks her treaty had established. At 44, Sarah had become one of the most recognizable figures in colonial America. Her face appeared on broadsheets distributed from Boston to Charleston, usually accompanied by articles debating whether she was a visionary peacemaker or a dangerous radical who had given too much power to savage nations. The controversy no longer bothered her. She had learned long ago that meaningful change always generated opposition from those who benefited from the old ways. The Morning Post had brought news that would have been unthinkable a quarter-century earlier. A Six Nations Confederacy had been formally invited to send representatives to a continental Congress being organized to address growing tensions between the American colonies and the British Parliament. Native diplomatic perspectives were now considered essential to any major political decision affecting North America. Sarah's personal transformation was equally remarkable. Her marriage to Thunderwolf had produced 3 children who embodied the future she had envisioned, equally comfortable in both worlds, fluent in multiple languages, trained in both Iroquois governance traditions and European diplomatic protocols. Their eldest daughter, Martha, now served as an interpreter for trade negotiations. Their twin sons had become leaders in their own right, one focusing on agricultural innovations that combine native and European farming techniques, the other establishing schools that taught both colonial and indigenous knowledge systems. But perhaps the most significant change was barely visible to casual observers. Across the frontier, a generation had grown up for whom peaceful coexistence between white and native communities was simply normal. Children who had never known the constant fear of raids and counter-raids, who learned each other's languages as naturally as they learned to walk, who understood that different didn't mean dangerous. The peace hadn't been perfect. There had been violations of the treaty, disputes over interpretation, moments when war seemed inevitable despite all the careful diplomatic architecture Sarah had built. But each crisis had been resolved through negotiation rather than violence, strengthening the precedent that problems could be solved without bloodshed. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Rebecca, now 50 and serving as the territorial administrator for the neutral zones established by the treaty. Her sister had never married, dedicating herself instead to the complex work of managing the hybrid communities that had emerged, where colonial and native territories bordered each other. The messenger from Onondaga arrived this morning, Rebecca announced, carrying a letter sealed with the official mark of the Grand Council. Bright Moon is dying. She's asking for you. Sarah felt a deep sadness at the news, though it wasn't unexpected. Bright Moon had been ancient when they first met, and she had lived to see her great work of peace-building become a permanent fixture of North American politics. The old woman had become Sarah's most important mentor, teaching her the subtle arts of consensus building and long-term strategic thinking that had made the treaty possible. "When do we leave?" Sarah asked, already mentally preparing for the journey to Iroquois territory. "The council is requesting that you arrive for the winter ceremony. Bright Moon wants to formally transfer her responsibilities as keeper of the peace to you before the ancestors call her home." The honor was unprecedented. No white person had ever been granted such status in Iroquois governance, but Sarah's quarter-century of service had earned her a unique position of trust and respect. She would become the first peacekeeper whose authority was recognized by both European and indigenous legal systems. As they prepared for the journey north, Sarah reflected on how far they had all traveled from that autumn morning when Wolf's raiders had destroyed Mill Creek. The frightened girl who had hidden in a root cellar had become a woman capable of reshaping the political landscape of a continent. The war chief who had taken captives to fill the emptiness in his heart had become a statesman whose wisdom was sought by leaders throughout the Americas. The trip to Onondaga took them through territories that perfectly illustrated the success of the Treaty of Two Rivers. Mixed communities where log cabins stood alongside traditional longhouses, where cornfields used both European plows and native Three Sisters planting techniques, where children with surnames like Whitmore Bear Claw and Thompson Red Sky played games that combined elements from both cultures. They were met at the village edge by Thunderwolf, now graying but still powerfully built, his presence commanding the same respect it had 25 years earlier. The reunion between Sarah and her husband was warm but brief. Duty called them both to Bright Moon's bedside. The old woman was conscious but clearly failing, her ancient body finally succumbing to the weight of nearly a century of life. But her mind remained sharp, her eyes still holding the wisdom that had guided so many crucial decisions. "Peace Speaker," Bright Moon said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you have exceeded even my highest hopes. The children being born today will never know a world where their peoples are at war with each other." Sarah knelt beside the bed, taking the old woman's frail hands in her own. "I had good teachers. Everything I accomplished was built on foundations you helped me understand. And now you must teach others. The peace we built between the 6 nations And the British colonies will face new challenges. The colonials grow restless under distant rule, speak of independence and self-governance. When that change comes, and it will come, you must ensure that native rights are protected in whatever new government emerges. The prophecy proved remarkably prescient. Within a decade, the American colonies had declared independence from Britain, fighting a revolutionary war that threatened to undo all the careful diplomatic work of the previous generation. But Sarah's influence, and the precedent of treating indigenous nations as equals, helped ensure that the new United States Constitution included provisions protecting tribal sovereignty, language that traced directly back to the Treaty of Two Rivers. Bright Moon died peacefully 3 days later, surrounded by the clan mothers, war chiefs, and peace speakers who had worked with her to build a new kind of relationship between peoples. Her funeral was attended by representatives from dozens of tribes, colonial governors, and European diplomats, a gathering that would have been impossible before. Sarah's work had made such cooperation normal, the ceremony transferring the peacekeeper responsibilities to Sarah was held at the same sacred grove where she had undergone the trial by ordeal so many years earlier. But instead of the terrifying spiritual testing of her youth, this ritual was a celebration of accomplishment, a recognition that the frightened girl who had sought to rescue her sister had become a woman capable of rescuing entire civilizations. From the cycle of violence that had seemed inevitable, Sarah's acceptance speech, delivered in both English and Mohawk, was later recorded by colonial historians as one of the founding documents of multicultural democracy in America. In it, she outlined a vision of the future where different peoples could maintain their distinct identities while participating in shared governance, where diversity was seen as strength rather than threat, where the differences between cultures could be celebrated rather than feared. "We have proven," she said to the assembled crowd, "that the choice between conquest and surrender is a false choice. We have created a third path, the path of respect, of negotiation, of peaceful coexistence between equals. This path is not always easy, but it is always possible for those brave enough to walk it." As Sarah stood in the grove where her transformation had begun, surrounded by people whose lives had been changed by her refusal to accept that war was inevitable, she understood that her greatest achievement wasn't preventing any single conflict, but creating a new model for how different peoples could live together. The girl who had been taken from Mill Creek as a captive had become a woman who captured the imagination of a continent, proving that even the most deeply rooted hatreds could be transformed by someone willing to build bridges instead of walls, to seek understanding instead of victory, to choose love over fear. Her legacy would outlive her by centuries, inspiring future generations of peacemakers, diplomats, and visionaries who understood that the most powerful force in human history wasn't conquest or domination, but the simple radical act of treating other people as equals worthy of respect, understanding, and cooperation. The Treaty of Two Rivers became the template for peaceful coexistence that influenced indigenous rights movements, international diplomacy, and constitutional law for generations to come. And at its heart was the story of two sisters whose love for each other had transformed into love for all humanity, proving that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of courage in defense of someone who matters more than life itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.